This is a second lecture for week 4, continuing the theme of attachment and relationships. This lecture continues where the previous lecture 4.1 left off by talking about attachment types that can be observed in early childhood and how those relate to attachment styles in adulthood. And just a brief recap of the previous lecture, one of the points that was made around defining attachment and really what characterizes attachment, thinking about it from infancy through adulthood, is really that attachment is about seeking and maintaining contact with a secure connection, with somebody who serves as a safe haven and as a secure base. So it's somebody who provides a feeling of safety and security. You can think about in early childhood, that's a child maybe running and hiding, putting their face in the legs of their mother or father when there's something that's a bit novel, strange. And maybe now as a young adult, you might find that your parents are still a secure base for you. And, if you need some support, if you're having some kind of a crisis that comes up, or you need money, or you need emotional, support or advice, they still serve as your secure base and that safe haven, someone who will take care of you and you feel secure with. So those needs for connection, comfort, and caring are key to the idea of attachment, and they continue to characterize experiences of attachment from infancy to adulthood. So in the previous lecture, I mentioned Mary Ainsworth, and she was a student of John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory, the person who developed it. But she took attachment theory and helped to formalize it and make the theory testable by developing a research context which allowed for the observation of different types of attachment. And that's the strange situation. And we're going to get more into this. You'll see a video in tutorial about the strange situation. But really, it's basically very similar to what would happen when a child is brought into like a new situation, like childcare, for example. So it's a scenario where there are sort of episodes where the mother and the infant, or other attachment figure, let's say father and infant, are brought into a room, and then the infant explores the room with the attachment figure watching but not participating. And there's a stranger who enters the room and is silent, then talks to the child, and then approaches the baby, and then the attachment figure leaves. So you might think that even something that could happen in a childcare situation where the parent stays for a little bit to make sure the child feels somewhat comfortable, but then the stranger, who's the teacher, approaches the child, and the stranger then in episode 4 does not play with the baby, but attempts to comfort the child if necessary. And then the attachment figure returns and comforts the baby. And we'll see when you actually watch the video, children have different reactions at these points. So number 5 is a reunion episode, and those reunion episodes are really important. And so then after that initial reunion at point 5, then the baby returns to play, and the mother leaves again. And then the stranger tries to calm the baby if the baby's upset, and play with the baby. And then after 3 minutes, then the attachment figure returns at point 8. So again, point 5 and point 8 are those reunion episodes when the observer is really seeing what happens when when the attachment figure is present. Does the child explore the environment? And what happens when the attachment figure and the child come back together? This table describes the kind of child behaviors that can be observed in relation to their attachment type in the strange situation, and the kinds of caregiver behaviors that are associated with these different types of attachment. So the first is secure attachment, and the great majority of children are securely attached. So upwards of 60% of children would be securely attached to their caregiver. And securely attached children are distressed when the caregiver leaves and happy when the caregiver returns, and the child uses the caregiver as a secure base to explore. So when the caregiver is there, the child is looking back to him or her and checking in, making sure they're present. And this kind of attachment is associated with caregiving that is sensitive and responsive to the child's needs, following the child's cues. Insecure attachment is classified as either avoidant, resistant, or disorganized. So Mary Ainsworth identified avoidant or resistant, which is also known as ambivalent attachment. And then later researchers have added disorganized as a type of attachment that's found with children who are exposed to trauma or abuse. So in general, caregivers of infants with insecure attachments tend to be less responsive to the signs of their infant's distress. So they're either less physically available or less psychologically or emotionally available or less sensitive to the child or unpredictable. So the table kind of breaks down the types of behaviors that tend to be seen in children. So with an insecure avoidant type of attachment, the child shows signs of ignoring the caregiver and not becoming distressed at the departure points or showing joy at the reunion points either. And this kind of behavior, this avoidant behavior, has been associated with caregiver behaviors where the caregiver has a tendency to ignore or reject the child's expressed needs and is intrusive in terms rather than sensitive when they have interactions, the one-on-one interactions. The insecure ambivalent or resistant, is also known as, type of attachment is preoccupied. The child is preoccupied with trying to get the caregiver's attention when she's present or he or she is present, and becoming distressed when the caregiver leaves. And when the caregiver returns, the child seeks contact, but avoids the comfort. So there's this sort of like seeking out but rejecting that's sort of happening at the same time with children. And the child may often show signs of anger as well. And this kind of behavior in the child is associated with caregivers that are inconsistently available to children. So the caregiver may sort of ignore the child, or sometimes they're very warm, but other times they're kind of cold and detached. So the child doesn't really know necessarily what to expect. There's an ambivalence in the relationship. And then the fourth type of attachment, as I mentioned before, this disorganized type of attachment, which was identified by researcher Mary Main, is insecure, disorganized attachment. And that kind of attachment is associated with children children are responding in ways that are dazed or disoriented or repetitive when the caregivers are there. And it suggests the child is experiencing confusion and anxiety in the relationship. And this is associated with caregivers who either are abusive towards the children or are in a situation of abuse. So it's described as a caregiver who is frightening, that would be the abusing caregiver, or frightened. So that would be the caregiver who is herself, let's say, the victim of a domestic violence. So there's trauma or abuse or neglect going on in the relationship. So there are these different patterns in terms of how young children have relationships with their caregivers and if they feel emotionally secure in those relationships. And the question is really, do those early experiences matter in terms of their later lives? And the short answer is yes, and the but is the resilience piece that came in week 2. So yes, it matters, but we always have to remember that we're talking about human beings and people can overcome early adversity. So it's not a life sentence. It's not like they're broken or something. So having attachment in early childhood is associated with being less independent for young children, and that makes sense in terms of using that attachment figure as a secure base for exploration makes the child feel comfortable in themselves to explore their environments. And securely attached children, that secure attachment is linked with positive emotional development, the capacity to regulate stress and deal with emotions. So there's a big piece around emotional regulation where the attachment relationship is very important for helping children deal with their strong feelings that come up, their feelings of anger and hurt, and how do they deal with those, so to develop the internal resources to calm themselves down. And the internal working model that I mentioned in the first lecture is proposed as an underlying mechanism, which is about how someone interprets the emotions of others. And I'll come back to that in a minute in terms of the kinds of messages about self that people seem to have when they're associated with different, it's related to the internal working model. But I do want to say that, again, people can change. So early childhood attachment is not destiny. Based on the experiences people have, the internal working model of attachment can shift and they can learn new ways of relating to each other, or to others. I just mentioned internal working models, and I had this is a slide from the previous lecture, but I just wanted to remind you that internal working models are basically this idea that the attachment behaviors that we observe and really are kind of related to underlying ways of seeing the self and seeing the world and relationships. So that's really what early attachment, that's what early attachment does, is sort of starts to create a way of seeing the world and the way of seeing the self that can have continuity into adulthood, as we'll see, because there is a relationship between attachment styles in early childhood and attachment, or attachment types in early childhood and attachment styles in adulthood. But back to that point that I made, that attachment type in early childhood is not destiny. It's also, attachment type can be open to change. So often when there is insecure attachment, and caregivers are not responding sensitively to the needs of a young child, they're carrying forward a type of relating that they had experienced themselves. And so, is there a way of changing the way that a caregiver relates to the child? And that is the question: is attachment open to some kind of intervention? And the answer is yes. So there are interventions where people working with families, like social workers, would try to do an intervention to try to improve attachment. So Circle of Security is a particular intervention that I know is being used in this area in the Illawarra and settings like playgroups to try to strengthen the attachment relationship. And this you can see this image here, and there's a extra video in the workbook for the lecture that you can have a look at too. It's really about educating parents or other caregivers about the idea of attachment and how they can provide a secure base and a safe haven for children, to let children explore, but to be responsive to them and to be available to them so that they have that sense of security. So is attachment type open to intervention? Absolutely. And that's a really good place to concentrate prevention when we know there are risk factors. You remember back to week 2 that we talked about risk factors. And when we know there's a risk factor there, something like being a teenage parent, for example, is associated with being a less sensitive caregiver. So when you know that someone's a teenage parent and maybe they weren't developmentally ready to be a parent quite yet, and they didn't have all the kind of skills in place yet, then there could be an intervention that's made at that point, which is not to say all teenage parents will be insensitive, but you can identify that there is a risk factor that elevates the risk of attachment issues there. And that's a point to do some prevention. And so something like Circle of Security is a kind of intervention that can be preventative. So again, there's a video you can have a look at about Circle of Security in the workbook. So as I mentioned with the idea of the internal working model, something that's important about attachment is that these early behaviors that we learn in relationships to our close attachment figures can be translated to later life and the ways we think about ourselves and the ways we think about others and the kinds of relationships we have with others. So what this comes down to is that there are these learned ways that some children who are securely attached learn to trust the caregiver, and others who have insecure attachment are not able to trust the caregiver, and that comes from those early experiences. And in time, the way that people see the world is colored by those early experiences. So colored by the way they were treated by their caregivers. So those early experiences then can sort of set that child's clock in a way, in terms of, they're always tending to go back when the power shuts off, they tend to go back to whatever that sort of set point was. And so secure and confident children have that internalized sense that when the caregiver goes away, the absence is temporary. They can trust that caregiver will come back and take care of that child, and the caregiver will be happy to see the child and will be supportive and loving, and that this feeling of security about the caregiver tends to create a broad confidence about the nature of relationships in the internal working model, that people are trustworthy and people will care for you. They're available to do that for you. And children with insecure attachment have more anxiety about the caregiver. Is the caregiver trustworthy? How will the caregiver respond? Will they be insensitive? Will they be intrusive? Will they ignore the child? Will they be that scary? Sort of, if there's abuse, for example. So that that uncertainty about whether and when the caregiver will return and what the caregiver will do when they come back, and is the child going to be treated lovingly? There's a kind of anxiety there for children, and that can create a feeling of sort of tension and lack of trust, and that anxiety can then extend in terms of the way that these children come to see relationships in later life. So that's the idea of the internal working model. Your early relationships lead you to expect to be treated in a certain way in other relationships. They form a template for later relationships. So research has borne out that the types of attachment that we form in early childhood tends to connect to how we relate to others in adulthood, and particularly in central relationships with romantic partners and intimate partners, the kind of relationships we form with our long-term, spouses or long-term partners. So again, I want to just insert the caution that you can't just say that it all goes back to the parents. It's quite Freudian to say that, it's all about the parents. But, there's been time that's elapsed from infancy into adulthood. And it's not necessarily the case that the kinds of attachments that adults form to their romantic partners are identical to the relationships that they had with their parents or other caregivers. There's been a lot of time, and there have been intervening experiences between infancy and adulthood. But there is research that suggests that, in general, if you look at groups, if you look at adults, there tends to be patterns that were established in childhood that have an important impact on later relationships. And again, it comes back to that idea of the internal working model about how people view relationships and how they view their selves, and of others. Is it negative or is it positive? So the adult with a secure working model perceives the self and others positively and is comfortable with the idea of intimacy, whereas the dismissing style sees the self in a positive light but doesn't trust others and can be defensive and protective against the idea of intimacy. The preoccupied style craves intimacy with others but doesn't see the self as worthy of love, creating a fear of loss. And the fearful type, which would be associated with the disorganized type of attachment, has a sense of both the self as unworthy and the other as unreliable. So, of course, these are some people are more complex, but you still might see a kind of pattern that you've observed in people, or even in yourself. These ideas can provide some kind of insight into how people manage their relationships, even though people may not always conform to one of these categories. But the underlying dynamic, really, the thing that's important, is the idea of anxiety and avoidance. The person wondering, will this intimate partner be available and responsive? Does the experience of intimacy cause discomfort? So these dynamics are also present in early childhood attachment between parent and child. Wondering, is my parent going to be responsive? Are they going to be available to me? And that's, that kind of refrain continues in adulthood. And what happens when there's intimacy? When you expose yourself with the parent, are you treated well? Are you not treated well? And so really these kinds of behaviors, acting in these dismissing or preoccupied or even fearful ways, they're really ultimately coping mechanisms for how the child who's become an adult has learned to relate to others. And in your reading, it described a longitudinal study. So, here we are relating back to week 2, a longitudinal study by Simpson and his colleagues, who observed, a cohort of people over time and followed, children with different types of attachment, and saw that having secure attachment in infancy then related to good relationship with peers in childhood, and that having good relationships with peers in childhood set people up to develop good friendships in adolescence, and that friendships were then positively correlated with positive romantic relationships. So, this research suggests it's not just the parent-child relationship that directly influences the romantic relationship, but actually that the parent-child relationship, being the prime relationship of early childhood, really set people up for positive peer relationships, which are really come to the fore in middle childhood and adolescence as being very important relationships. And then that prepares people in early adulthood to have positive romantic relationships. So sort of along the steps, each type of relationship sets people up for the next in terms of, again, the underlying mechanism of the internal working model is what people believe about the world, that it's fundamentally positive or fundamentally negative and you have to be protective. Is that assumption borne out in their relationships? So, but again, I want to point out that the internal working model can change. So people are resilient. They can respond to adversity by overcoming having an insecure attachment in infancy, and end up still having positive relationships with friends, and also having positive romantic relationships. So, and the last thing I want to say in terms of attachment types and styles is really to raise the question, which came up in week 2. A lot of the research that we do to identify, to look at human development tends to be with non-diverse populations, tends to be within the Western context. So is attachment a theory that is relevant across cultures, in non-Western societies? And it seems to be that the attachment behaviors are observed in other cultures, certainly, and that the parent-child relationship is influenced by culture, so it may look different in different contexts, but the idea of that connection, that early connection, and using the parent as a secure base, those are characteristics we can see in relationships in other countries as well. So you see here, these are photos of a Maasai mother and child, and so you can see the affection in the left, and the kind of delight and joy in the interaction, and then also use the child using the mother as a secure base and sort of clinging to the mother. That's a very recognizable behavior that we see, across cultures. Your reading on page 402 discusses studies that have used a strange situation in different cultural contexts, and it points out that while certain cultures, they socialize children in different ways, basically. So German parents encourage independence and discourage clinging, and so you tend to see more insecure avoidant classifications in Germany. And in Japan, you tend to see more dependence and greater distress. So you're going to see different kinds of patterns in cultures because different cultures socialize children differently. But there's still an underlying dynamic in terms of the importance of the relationship between an attachment figure and a child. And part of the reason that we might think that it's a universal type of theory is that, like Bowlby pointed out, the relationship between particularly an infant and their caregiver is really something that we need as human beings because evolution requires that we have somebody who takes care of us when we're in that dependent infant stage. So that's, attachment is relevant across cultures, although attachment may look different in different cultures because it may be adaptive to that particular cultural context. Because there are a lot of ideas in the first lecture and in this lecture, I just want to summarize some of the main points about attachment theory that were covered in the first 2 lectures. So first is that attachment types develop as children adapt to the behavior of their caregivers. So children are looking to their caregivers to see whether the caregivers and how the caregivers will respond to their needs. And so all the types characterize the relationship and not the child. So a child is insecurely attached, let's say, but with another caregiver, that child could develop a secure attachment. It's really about the dynamic of the relationship and what the child comes to expect from that relationship. And attachment types become internalized in children. They develop as the internal working model that really can serve as a template for future relationships in terms of characterizing how the child comes to see the self and others as basically trustworthy or not. And attachments in early childhood through the internal working model can then influence later relationships. But the internal working model is open to change. Again, that idea of resilience, that people are open to change. So that'll conclude the second lecture for week 4. And then our next lecture will look more closely at the parent-child relationship.